for our next episode of the Innovation Moment, I've got a very interesting topic to talk about. Now, folks may have heard that my definition of innovation is that it's a new way of doing things that adds value. But today we are going to tackle how do you bring these new ideas, new products. Joining me for this discussion is Loran Nordgren, who is a professor at the Kellogg School of Management and has a national best-selling book called The Human Element: Overcoming the Resistance That Awaits New Ideas. Loran's mission is to use behavioral science to make leaders and organizations better. He's a former Fulbright scholar, has twice received Kellogg's Management Teacher of the Year award, and also was one of Poets and Quant's 40 under 40 business school professors. As a practitioner, Loran has worked with companies throughout the world on a wide range of behavioral change problems, a process he calls behavioral design. We are very excited to have you here, Loran, and I'd also like to introduce Stacy Wolcott. Stacy is a lead in our innovation consulting practice, where she works with clients like Nike and Baxter to advance their innovation strategies. In addition to serving clients, Stacy is passionate about working with students in her role as an adjunct professor in the Siegel Design Institute within McCormick School of Engineering and Applied Science at Northwestern University. Prior to joining Accenture, Stacy was the vice president of Experience Design, a digital agency where she led design teams to create digital strategies and uncover new solutions for clients. So excited to have both of you in the discussion today. And maybe to start off with, since this is the innovation moment, Loran, what does innovation mean to you?
Thank you. It's great to be here. I love your definition, by the way. I suppose my definition of innovation would be conventional. It might be something like, how do we transform our ideas and aspirations into action? But the piece of innovation that I think most about is really on not the where does the good idea come from, but rather how do we create it? How do we implement it? How do we put this new thing, this new path, this new idea, product, social change, whatever it is, how do we take it and see it?
Stacy, what about you? What's your definition of innovation?
Yeah, I think those are both such great answers. And I think if you think about this notion of invention, which is the joy of creating something that now exists in the world that never existed before, innovation really does take that one step further and applies that discovery to actually create value. But we're only able to really capture or realize that value through the process of organizational collaboration and alignment, and then ultimately having a responsive market that is willing and able to adopt this new idea. So that's why I am particularly excited to be talking about friction theory and how we can overcome some of these frictions today.
Awesome. I love both those definitions. Loran, you reminded me of another saying I always use, and I tell my teams, Stacy knows this, is innovation without execution is hallucination, right? As you, that's the traditional strategy without execution, but I've changed it to innovation without execution. And I heard you say that. And Stacy, loved your definition of innovation needs to create value. If it doesn't, it's not worth it. Loran, in your book, The Human Element, you actually explore the forces that often prevent innovative ideas from seeing the light of day. And you also share a lot of strategies, bring it to life with several stories. Could you share a bit more about this whole idea of friction?
Yeah. So fundamental idea that we're putting forward is that, so when people are trying to bring new ideas to life, they tend to operate on this assumption. And the assumption is that the way you do this, the way you get people to embrace innovation and change, is by elevating the appeal of the idea itself. We entice, we attract, we try and make our idea magnetic. And we refer to that sort of any strategy designed to add appeal or excitement or attraction as fuel. And the job of fuel is to incite our desire to change. Now, our principal argument is that we operate in what we might call a fuel-based mindset. We naturally think in fuel. We think this is the way you drive a new idea forward. Our proposition is that in focusing on fuel, on adding excitement and appeal and value, we miss the other half of the equation. And these are the psychological forces that oppose change. And we refer to those forces as frictions. And whereas we are extremely familiar with fuel, we have departments devoted to them. Marketing deals in the business of fuel. HR, like in the sense of incentives, often deals in the business of fuel. Frictions we are much less acquainted with because they're often hard to see. But the basic idea is that we look at these four aspects of human nature that oppose change. Now, that is, I'm sure, quite abstract. Allow for an example. And I think a good way to understand friction is to think about the structure of an idea, the anatomy of an idea or innovation. So one dimension of any new idea is what degree of change is represented in it. Does it represent? In other words, are we talking a radical transformation, or are we talking about a slight tweak on what's come before? And the degree of change in a new idea determines what we would call inertia, the first friction. And the idea of inertia, and it captures how our human nature generally opposes new ideas, is that the human mind naturally favors the familiar over the unfamiliar. So the human mind values what is known, what is comfortable, what is familiar over the unknown, even when the unknown thing has indisputable benefits. And I'm acutely feeling this right now because my email system just updated and I have a whole new format and the things aren't where I knew them to be, and that is distressing for me. The human mind favors the familiar over the unfamiliar. And if you think about it, is an ever-present friction for an innovator, because in some sense, the very act of innovation is getting people to buy in to the unfamiliar. So when we are talking about frictions, what we are talking about are these aspects of human nature that oppose new ideas, that orient us toward what is known, what is comfortable, what is familiar, the status quo, and what positions us against change. And what we're trying to do is explore them and also learn to disarm them.
That's great. In your book, you also take it one step further and you talk about different kinds of friction. Some of them, I know, Stacy, you can relate to with some of your current work. But before we go into those examples, Loran, would be good to get just a quick overview from you on the different types of frictions that.
Absolutely. So we think in terms of four principal frictions. The first I mentioned, which is, does your idea, this new innovation, does it represent a radical shift from the status quo, or is it a slight tweak? That will determine the degree to which the first friction, which we call inertia, inhabits the idea. So if you are trying to bring about radical transformation, the very fact that it is radical transformation means there will be greater resistance in this idea. If it's a totally foreign, unfamiliar idea, that will naturally create more resistance than a more familiar idea. So the first friction is what we call inertia. The second dimension of any idea is it's the cost of implementation. So when we're trying to bring new ideas into the world, there is almost always some implementation cost. Now, that can be slight, but often it's considerable. So particularly in the context of, say, organizational change, we're trying to change processes. We need to learn new systems, change routines and schedules, et cetera. The more effort in the idea, the greater the cost of implementation, the greater the second friction is in your idea. It's what we call effort, or an effort-based friction. The human mind is hardwired to conserve energy. So imagine I were to tell you, this isn't going to be an hour-long session. This is going to be a 3-hour session. Think about what your first thought is. Your first thought is not, wow, think of all the value we are going to create in those 2 additional hours. Your first thought is, I can't believe we're going to spend an extra 2 hours on this. The human mind is highly sensitive to effort expenditure. The more effort that is required in our change initiative, the more resistance we face. The third dimension speaks to the reactions our idea creates. So what we want is our innovations to produce positive emotions like confidence, delight, excitement, et cetera. But what often happens is, even in good ideas, within unquestionably great ideas, we can nevertheless produce unintended negative emotions, fear, uncertainty, etc. And when those are there, they serve as a very powerful friction operating against change. And the final friction speaks to the relationship between the innovator and the audience. And really the core question here is, does the audience believe that they have arrived at this new idea, this new innovation on their own accord, or have they been forced to change? And the more it is the latter, the more reactants, our fourth friction is reactants, likely inhabits the idea. And it speaks to this aspect, this fascinating aspect of human nature, which is that when people feel pressured or pushed to change, often the natural reaction is not to go along with that initiative, but rather to fight against it. So those are the four frictions we think about: inertia, effort, emotion, and reactants.
That's fantastic. Now, the concept of effort, emotion, inertia, I think those are, for the most part, quite standard, right? In different ways and forms or different names, people have heard that before. But I think one that is probably people are less familiar with is this friction of reactants. I think based on the way Loran described the concept of reactants for friction, I know you probably see this a lot with the work that you do and how you support your clients for innovation. Maybe you can share a bit more on what is it that you are seeing around this concept of reactants for friction, and what are some of the tips to overcome it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are seeing this. It's interesting, not only in new ideas that others are trying to launch, but also in the design of a new innovation team or a lab itself. So often one of the first decisions that a new innovation leader needs to make is how centralized do they want this team structure and this function to be. So some organizations decide to mandate that a lot of innovation initiatives need to flow through their group, whereas others take a different approach, and they might start with a couple of friendly leaders that they have relationships with. They build up a couple quick wins, they build trust and credibility, and then over time, they start to build this narrative of value for the broader organization. And so we find that former strategy tends to be the most successful, because that's the way to really bring people along on the journey and build this platform for innovation across the entire organization, rather than be seen as the group that's stifling or trying to control who gets to be an innovator. So that's one example and one thing that we're seeing. Another story that I'll share actually combines this notion of reactants and then the concept of inertia, Loran, that you were talking about. We're working with a client right now where we are uncovering new growth areas that are adjacent to their core business. So totally different spaces than what they do today. And what we're finding is that some of these spaces are actually a little bit threatening or could potentially disrupt the core. And as we're working with executives, one of the things that we're anchoring to is their mission statement. So their mission statement is an enduring statement that's focused on their values. And we're tying those hunting grounds that we're calling them, or adjacent innovation spaces, back to that mission statement to help these executives see how these new ideas, even though they seem totally foreign, can actually help advance that mission, even if the organization that they know today might eventually evolve.